Last year, Casio celebrated the 40th anniversary of the creation of the G-Shock watch, and they did so by releasing a ton of different anniversary models. Probably the most sought after and anticipated of these was the DW-5000R, which was released at the very end of last year. This is probably the most faithful recreation of the original G-Shock watch that has been yet produced, and G-Shock collectors went nuts over it. However, like I said, Casio released a lot of models celebrating their 40th anniversary, and there's another one that looks almost identical to this 5000R that is about half the cost and much more easy to get your hands on. I think for people who aren't collectors, that might be the better option in the DW-5600RL. Hey guys, this is Dave. Welcome back to my channel, Just the Watch, where as always, I'm recording from my home in Iwate, Japan. And today we're going to be taking a look at two Japanese watches in the Casio G-Shock DW-5000R and the DW-5600RL. Both of these watches look almost identical to the original G-Shock from 1983. And I think most people are familiar with the DW-5600 line of G-Shocks. That's the current sort of standard entry-level G-Shock, and it is in itself an evolution of that first G-Shock that was made in 1983. So its heritage definitely comes from that original G-Shock. It's also one of the most affordable G-Shocks on the market, and this DW-5600RL version has a color scheme and design that very closely resembles that first G-Shock. But it is basically just a DW-5600 with a retro paint job. The DW-5000, on the other hand, comes from a slightly more premium line of G-Shock watches. It looks basically identical on the exterior. The big difference is that the interior of the watch is made out of stainless steel. So it's got a stainless steel core with this resin case around it for shock resistance. It also features a screw-on case back and a slightly different module. So that's cool, except there is one key area where this module in the DW-5000 actually performs worse than the module in this DW-5600. We'll get to that in a minute. And both of these watches that we're looking at, thankfully, are not limited productions. You should be able to buy either of these watches from Casio for the foreseeable future. However, the DW-5000 is a lot harder to get your hands on because it was so popular. It sold out in many places, and so now it's often selling at above the retail price, whereas this 5600RL, at least here in Japan, is widely and easily available at the retail price or even under the retail price. So in this video, I want to go over all the differences between the two watches to help you see whether or not it is worth it for you to upgrade to the DW-5000, or if you're better off going with the standard DW-5600RL. So if you look at these two watches, they look basically identical to each other unless you really know what you're looking for. They both look like a classic G-Shock square with a retro color scheme applied to it. Now, as I'm holding them in my hand, I can clearly tell the difference because one is a lot heavier than the other. And if you purchase them yourselves, you'll clearly be able to tell the difference because one will make your wallet a lot lighter than the other. The retail price of the DW-5000R is $200, which is twice that of the DW-5600RL. And that's assuming that you can find the DW-5000R at the retail price. It's currently sold out in a lot of places, so there's a lot of places that are charging more than retail. There are some differences between these two watches in terms of the build, and that has to do with the lines that they're in. The DW-5000 has a metal inner case, whereas the DW-5600 has your standard resin on both the inside and the outside. Both of these watches feature LED backlights. Both of them are coated in bio-resin. And both of them are bringing back the original color scheme and a lot of design elements from that original G-Shock from 1983. But while they both look like that original G-Shock from 1983, the DW-5000R actually takes things a lot further in terms of the functionality, including having a module which I believe is unique to this watch. So what's the deal here? Why is one of these watches twice the cost of the other one? And why is one of these watches in so much higher demand than the other one? Well, there's really two main things going on here. For one, the DW-5000 comes from a line of premium G-Shock squares that feature a stainless steel inner case. In recent years, Casio has used this line of G-Shock watches to create slightly more premium versions, mostly special editions, often in very interesting colors and collaborations. But the stainless steel case doesn't really add any functionality at all to the watch. It just makes it feel a little bit more premium, and it does cost more to manufacture a stainless steel watch than an all-plastic one. And that's the route that Casio has taken with the DW-5600 series, which is kind of the successor to that original DW-5000. The DW-5600 series ditched the stainless steel inner case a long time ago, resulting in a watch that is both cheaper to produce and a little bit lighter on the wrist, while arguably being just as tough as the original stainless steel version. I suppose there's an argument to be made that the stainless steel inner case in the DW-5000R does make it tougher, maybe it makes it more crush resistant, but the DW-5600 with its standard resin inner case is still one of the toughest watches in the world, and if you want to talk about which one is stronger, we're kind of splitting hairs here. Now, because the DW-5000 has that metal inner case as well as the screw-down case back, it makes it a little bit thicker and a lot heavier than your standard DW-5600. And it is an interesting experience wearing that heavier metal watch on your wrist. It basically looks identical to the standard DW-5600 because both are covered in this bio-resin plastic, but the DW-5000, again, does feel a little bit heavier. The thickness, on the other hand, isn't really that noticeable. It's only about a 0.5 millimeter. If you put the two of them side by side, you'll see it, but you probably won't notice it on the wrist. The second reason this particular DW-5000, the DW-5000R, is so desirable is because it is one of the most faithful recreations of that original 1983 DW-5000 first G-Shock that Casio has ever made. And that's the part that's really been driving collectors, particularly G-Shock collectors, crazy, and why this particular G-Shock is getting so much praise and is in such high demand. And that's all great if you're a die-hard G-Shock fan, but if you just want a cool retro-looking G-Shock, you can get a watch that looks almost exactly like it for half the price that's readily available right now. Up till now, the differences that we've discussed are differences between the DW-5000 and DW-5600 lines of watches. Again, there are many models in both of these lines, but we're looking at two very specific models from each of these lines that look very similar, that are both references to that original G-Shock, and were both released to commemorate the 40th anniversary of that original G-Shock. So let's move on and look at what these anniversary editions bring to the table. Okay, so let's take a look at the front of the watch so you guys can see what they've done on these anniversary editions, and then let's also see if you can pick out what the differences are between the DW-5000 and the DW-5600. I'll give you a few seconds, pause the video, and see what you can see yourself, and then we'll jump into it. So let's go through the biggest differences here. The DW-5000R has this brick pattern on the inner part of the dial, which was what the original G-Shock had. To modern eyes, it looks a little bit tacky, but hey, that's what the 80s was all about. I actually prefer the design of the DW-5600 version because I think it looks a little bit cleaner, but the 5000R is way closer to what the original G-Shock looked like. Other than that, there's some differences in terms of fonts and some of the text that's on there. The rest is fairly minor. It doesn't make much of a difference to me visually, but again, if you want something that matches what the original G-Shock looks like, the DW-5000R has all of these kind of cool, quirky little nods to that model. Another difference that you may or may not have noticed is that the bezel on the DW-5000R is completely flat, whereas the DW-5600 has these kind of raised areas where it says protection and G-Shock. That little raised section on the DW-5600 is pretty much standard across all versions of the DW-5600, but Casio hasn't made a G-Shock square with a flat bezel like this in a long time, and again, that's referencing what the original looked like. Another difference is that the light button and the start-stop button has been reversed on the DW-5000, again referencing what the original was like. The DW-5600 keeps those two buttons on the right side of the watch in their standard positions for modern G-Shock squares. So if you're used to having your backlight button on the lower right side of the watch, it's going to take some learning to get used to the new DW-5000 position, or technically the old position. One welcome change on the DW-5000 is that the adjust button is slightly easier to operate. It's still harder to hit than the other buttons on the watch, but it is still a little bit easier to access than the adjust button on the DW-5600, which is notoriously difficult to hit. Both of these modules have the same functions. You're getting the time with the date, a single alarm, a timer, and a stopwatch, but the layout and the icons on the DW-5000R are a little bit different. Once again, they've reverted back to what you had on the original G-Shock square. For example, the icons for the hourly chime and the alarm have been moved over to the right side of the watch and simplified down to a little wave with a dot in the middle. Whereas on the DW-5600, they're on the left side of the display and they have a little series of waves and a bell. And again, if you're a G-Shock collector, if you're interested in getting a recreation of that original G-Shock, all of these little touches are super cool. But if you're just looking for a cool, affordable G-Shock watch, this probably isn't going to impress you very much. Personally, what I would have liked to have seen would have been the addition of world time to this module, because that's a feature that I really like that I always wish that my DW-5600 had, but giving you new functionality is not the point of the DW-5000R. While we're talking about the module, let's talk about some of the things that I think they kind of got wrong on this. It's got Casio's super bright white LED backlight, which is definitely not retro. I don't know what kind of backlight the original DW-5000 had. It was probably a weak amber colored backlight. So maybe for accuracy, go with that. Or if you want to be cool, put an electroluminescent one, because Casio has sort of stopped doing that on a lot of their newer watches. Anyways, that's a minor thing. The thing that's going to probably drive some people crazy is the viewing angles on this new module. I'm not super OCD about this kind of stuff. For me, it's kind of a minor annoyance, but I've seen a lot of people online really complaining about this lately on Casio watches. And that is that on a lot of their newer digital modules, the viewing angle, when you view it straight on, like 180 degrees above the watch, it loses contrast. So they didn't optimize it for looking straight at the watch. But if you look at it a little bit at an angle, you get a pretty sharp contrast. And I do often look at my watch from an angle, so in those times it's okay. But there are times when I'll look at it straight on, and I do get a little bit annoyed at seeing the display kind of fade a little bit. And here's the thing, the viewing angle on the cheaper watch, the DW-5600RL, is a little bit better than on the 5000R. And I really don't get that, because you would think the 5000R is supposed to be the more premium of the two. But the plot gets even thicker, because if you look at the DW-5600E, which is an older version, it's one of the oldest versions of the G-Shock Square that's in modern production. It's also one of the cheapest versions that's available. It still features the older electroluminescent backlight, which I kind of prefer. Anyways, on that one, the viewing angle is much better than either of these two watches. So if that kind of thing really bothers you, you're going to have kind of a hard time with this DW-5000R. Okay, we're almost to the end of the differences between these two watches. The next one is a big one, and that is the location in which they're manufactured. The DW-5000R is manufactured here in Japan in Yamagata Prefecture. For me, that's cool because I live in the same region of Japan as Yamagata. I live over in Iwate, so it's a prefecture that's kind of nearby. Both Iwate and Yamagata are pretty rural prefectures, so for me that's kind of cool that you're kind of getting outside of the big Tokyo area. And as you've probably already guessed, the Casio factory in Yamagata is where the original Casio G-Shock was first created and manufactured. The anniversary edition of the DW-5600RL, well, that's produced in Thailand. It says so on the case back. And that finally brings us to the last thing that we can talk about as a difference between the two watches, and that is that if you look at the straps, there's little bumps or dimples around the holes on the strap of the DW-5000R, whereas it's smooth on the DW-5600. And that about wraps it up for the differences between the two. I'm sure there's probably a few more that I missed, but I think that gives you enough of an idea of what you're looking at when you consider both of these watches. And really, I think what it comes down to is that the DW-5000R is going to be an attractive watch for G-Shock collectors, like guys who are really into G-Shock watches. But if you happen to be a watch collector who just likes G-Shock watches, I think the DW-5600RL is going to be a better option for most people. I think the price point on the DW-5600RL at around $100 is a great price point for this watch. I really appreciate the retro stylings. I think it looks cool, and I think they've done a good job of even kind of updating it a little bit, sort of cleaning it up a little bit while preserving that character of the original G-Shock watch. Personally, I don't really need all of those little details that the DW-5000R brings to the table. I think it's really cool that this watch exists, but for me personally, it's not worth double the price of a standard G-Shock. And it's also worth noting that Casio has had a watch that has this shape and color scheme out for a while in the GW-5610, which is a solar and multi-band 6 version of the G-Shock Square, and that one retails for $150, and it also features world time. So for me personally, that would probably be the one that I would be most interested in getting my hands on. And if you're interested in learning more about that watch, I do have a review of it in a slightly different colorway. I'll be sure to leave a link to that at the end of the video. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up the review for today. Drop me a comment down below. Let me know which of these two watches were your favorite. Are you a true die-hard G-Shock collector that has to hunt down the DW-5000R? Or would you be satisfied with the retro color scheme on the DW-5600RL? For me personally, I don't find that the DW-5000 offers enough additional value for me to justify the cost. If you just want a good G-Shock watch that has that retro look, I think the DW-5600RL version is going to be the better buy. But I'm sure some of you disagree. If you're interested in picking up a watch-themed t-shirt like this one, you can get it at justthewatch.com. But that will wrap it up for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.